Everyone, and welcome to Talking About Survivor. I'm Christiana Ellis.
And I'm Mike Mateen.
Tonight, we're talking about Survivor Island of the Idols, episode 8, which I'm just calling episode 8 because that's how it's referred to on the little episode description, despite it being a 2-hour episode. But something that we'll go ahead and briefly address right up front is that this was a controversial set of episodes, to say the least. And so as a result, I think that we're probably going to have a slightly atypical format for this episode where we're not necessarily just going to go beat by beat through the whole 2 hours. But this was an episode where, before I had even watched it, you messaged me while you were watching it to basically say, "Hey, have you watched it yet?" You want to tell me a little bit about that, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things, we've talked about it before in the ones where you kind of get taken out of the game a little bit and you start seeing it as more real than it's supposed to be. We've seen it when people have referenced, illnesses back home or things like that, but this was such an extreme example, and it just left me, just not being entertained, really feeling just kind of uncomfortable with the way that a lot of people were behaving. And obviously it's centered around Dan and their discomfort with his, just how affectionate he is with people who don't necessarily want it or know him that well. But he's definitely not the only one, and that's what made it so kind of disconcerting. He's not the only one who just behaved in a way that was really complicated to work through.
Yeah.
And it just, the whole thing, my mind just spinning, and I'm trying to think, how are we going to talk about this? I have complicated feelings about this. There's people who I really like and still do really like, but they're acting in a way that if they did that in a real life scenario, I would be very, very frustrated with them. And I would be unhappy with them. And trying to keep that in the context of the game. Some of them are putting things that I don't think belong in the game solely in the box of the game, and it's hard for me to disagree with that reasoning, but it made me uncomfortable when I felt like it shouldn't have been there. And so I'm just going through all this stuff, and it's just I don't really know how I feel about all of this. And that's not what I want to watch the show for. Is to have to kind of there's plenty of other things in real life where we can explore these ideas in society that, for it to infiltrate this game where it just didn't seem necessary was just hard for me. And then I think I even told you, and then it was coupled with when I kind of took a step back from it, it was also coupled with some gameplay stuff that were just frustrating.
Yeah.
You couldn't even just go in and rack and re-enjoy the game because you're just well, that was annoying. Why did you do that? You were set up to do such a good thing, and then you messed this thing up. And now we're back to talking about this, Dan's behavior and how people are responding to it. It's God, now we're back into that again. And it's just 2 hours of that, and knowing that, how we like to have the conversation about how these things relate to real life. And, it just couldn't ever sit in the right place for me. Yeah. And, and that's why I messaged you, because it was I don't know that I'm ready to talk about this episode. I didn't want to, this was not the format I wanted to work through how I felt about everything. I kind of wanted to do that on my own, and then we can have the conversation about why we felt the way we did on the onset, and how we've kind of settled into it, and sort of where we're left and where we go from here.
Right.
So that's part of why we waited to record this one a little bit.
Yeah. So once I had been sort of made aware that stuff went down, before I even had the opportunity to watch it, because it was, of course, a 2-hour episode that I wasn't able to watch, Wednesday night. And so I decided to spoil myself. I looked up the basic details of what happened. Because this seemed like the way I was seeing some people react to it on Twitter and the way you reacted made me think like this is not just a startling twist in the game. This is something different. And so I certainly agreed with you, especially once I had a chance to watch it, that probably best with a complicated situation like this to let things steep a little bit without having to try to process everything instantaneously. And so I agree. And so that we're recording a little bit later in the week for that reason. But one of the things that occurs to me, just to sort of tangent a little bit off of the way you put it, is that it does frequently come up, the distinction between real life and the game, right? It's certainly true that in the game of Survivor, there are behaviors that in real life, doing finger quotes here for the people in the audio, in real life, lying, betraying people, like these are all like actions to which we would assign a moral weight. But when you're playing a game where that's all the premise of it, it is different because everyone is voluntarily participating in a game where that is an expected part of it. And so the idea of lying or betraying someone in Survivor is different. It is a different context, right? But that said, it is still real in the sense that these are real people playing a game, right? And so when there are behaviors that are not the game, but affect the game, like that is real, right? And so like the thing that struck me is that although there's no sort of bad intent, I think that this does represent a failing on the producers in terms of not having anticipated this or handled it better. And I'm not sure it's certainly not a simple solution. But for example, there are rules about people's behavior on the island.
Right.
You're not allowed to punch each other, right? Like if one player punched another in the face, they probably wouldn't ask the punched player and say, well, how do you feel about that? Do you think that we should intervene? Because that puts it on that person. And now that person has to decide, like, am I the person who's going to blow up my game by being the one that gets someone else taken out? No, they wouldn't do that. They would just say, punching people's against the rules, you're gone.
Yeah, and it's a slightly different example, but I think it's still relevant in other reality shows like The Bachelor, for example. Mm-hmm. There have been times, particularly in the Paradise version, which is a little more loose, where there have been people who have had real threats of violence against each other, like they were going to fight or have thrown people to the ground, and maybe not necessarily punched, but they have taken it beyond, and they have simply just asked everybody, the people involved, to leave, and they just said, "This isn't something we're going to have here, and this isn't part of what we're trying to do. You don't get to explain yourself at this point."
Right.
And and you can talk about it in the reunion show if you want to, if you feel you got something to express, but you're no longer going to be here because this is going in a direction that, it has gone beyond whether or not it's good TV or entertaining TV because it's controversial. Mm-hmm. It's just not what we want. And they reserve the right to do that.
Yeah.
Here. So I talked a little bit on that. I felt for a long time the way you did, but again, without knowing the actual interviews with the contestants by the producers, at first I was like, well, I mean, of course, like no one wants to just like say Dan needs to leave,
Right.
like when they put in that kind of context. But then I have to give them a little bit of credit. They've been doing this for a long time. And especially as you kind of look through the rest of it, it's like, while it was very real for some of them, he had gotten better. And I think and this is what kind of frustrated me, is what brought it back to the head, like, because he kind of, especially once his friend came back and he kind of left the two girls who were primarily worried about this alone, it was that the other ones kind of ramped them up. Like Elizabeth, like allowing that to continue. And when she probably did, when she interviewed with the producers, probably said, look, it doesn't bother me, but, I get that it's something that they have, and I want to kind of fan that flame because it makes sense for my game to kind of have Kelly believe that I'm on her side. And it's just, and the thing is that her fanning that flame is kind of what made it keep going. Whereas Kelly may have just said, which again, I also don't know if that's okay. And that's one of those complicated things. Like Kelly might have just said, look, okay, I get it. Maybe I'm just being a little more sensitive to it. He's leaving me alone now. If he comes back and tries to, touch me again, I'll say something. But clearly everybody else isn't feeling that way. But when everybody else says they're feeling that way, then of course it reinforces what she's feeling and makes her feel even more legitimized in it. And then when they come and turn on her and they're like, we weren't really feeling like that. You're just a sucker. And it's like, well, that was kind of shitty. And they say, well, it's in the context of the game. And I don't know. But I can see, I guess, where the producers, if everybody is saying like, no, this isn't as big a deal as it sounds, we're kind of ramping it up to create this false drama. I guess I could see why they would let it go, because he isn't actually a threat to anybody. But I don't know.
But it's also true that the producers have an incentive to produce drama on TV, as opposed to a sometimes competing priority of making sure all the players feel safe. Right.
And I think that's where I come from a little bit with what made me so frustrated with this, is that, Disney obviously is a phenomenal experience. You'll see where I'm going with this in a second, from a customer service standpoint.
Sure.
And, they do a lot of training with other companies about like their pillars and their philosophies of how they provide it. And the number one thing that they always preach coming out of Disney is that people at an event or an attraction or whatever, safety is always trumps everything else. It doesn't matter how cool something might be or how creative you are. If someone doesn't feel safe in your environment, anyone doesn't feel safe, then that has to be taken care of first, even if it's at a detriment to the experience of maybe some others. And they preach that. And so it's something I've always subscribed to is, again, working where I work, if safety is going to make things uncomfortable for some fans, but not in an unsafe way, but maybe make their wait time a little bit longer. Wait times suck, but if we want to make sure that our venue is safe and that people feel comfortable coming to that place and don't think our security measures are lax and they may be in danger, then we need to have wait times. That trumps the wait times. And so that's where I was leaning with this in the beginning, is like, even if it was only Kelly and Missy who felt unsafe, that's enough.
Remember, Molly was uncomfortable with them too before she was eliminated earlier in the season.
True, and Molly was as well. So it's like, but then the complicated part comes in of, is this something that you want to ruin Dan's entire life reputation over, when I think we all agree he doesn't have malintent. He just has a complete misunderstanding of personal space.
I will push back on that.
Okay, I would listen to that.
I believe that he is sincere when he says that. But the fact is, she talked to him about it and he didn't stop.
You're right. That's right.
And then when she complains about it and she takes him aside and specifically addresses it in a very open way of just saying, listen, I understand you're just being friendly. This is how you express affection. I understand where you're coming from, but I am asking you because it makes me feel uncomfortable to not do that anymore. And he stops for a while, but then we see follow-up incidents where she's clearly reacting like, no, get off of me. And this was after she talked to him about it.
Yep.
And so the point is that I think he's the kind of person, or at least he demonstrates this behavior, which doesn't necessarily define him in total as a person. But this behavior that he has is, well, she said no this time, but then when I did it again, she didn't say anything, so it's fine now, right?
Right. And I don't get the feeling that he's overtly doing that. I think he's just going into a default. And the unfortunate thing with him is that, his argument that, well, no one's ever expressed this to me before in life, and so this can't possibly be true, that's part of what drives home the point that this is a little bit bigger than just the game.
It also doesn't matter if it has never bothered anyone else before. If it bothers Kelly and she tells him and he doesn't stop, that is enough to be bad all by itself.
You're 100% correct there too. And even further from that is the recognition that, okay, that's part of what we're going through right now, is that there are places and industries and society setups where people don't feel like maybe feeling this and never expressed it to you. And so that's not a valid defense anymore.
Yeah.
You may have always been fortunate enough to be in a situation where you had enough power. Unfortunate, a weird way to put it.
Well, right. Yeah.
Yeah. But you've been in a position of power where no one's ever going to speak up. And therefore you've never been confronted about this. Like you can't say, well, I've never heard that this bothers anybody before, so it can't be true. That's just not, you have to take, like you said, first of all, each situation individually, but then also think back that there may be a lot of things you never heard about.
Right.
And
let's look at Kelly, because right off the bat, she's put in this position where she's concerned that being more forceful about her feelings will hurt her game. And that's why she isn't more forceful. Not because she doesn't actually care, but because she knows that coming forward will be bad for her.
Right.
And probably worse for her than for him. I mean, we talk about, ruining men's lives, and it would certainly not be great to be accused by, by something, but it's also like, but how many people is that person hurting? And also, how ruined are they actually? I mean, we don't need to get into the ins and outs, but I think part of what was so upsetting about this pair of episodes is that, we talk about Survivor as being this little psychological microcosm of society. Well, what we saw in this pair of episodes is this drama playing out exactly how it does so often in society, which is that the people who speak up get punished for it, while in the meantime, the person who is the actual perpetrator gets to have people fawn all over them and say, oh, she's just crazy. She didn't know what she's talking about. You're fine. We love you. And so, okay, sure, he's also getting confronted, but who's still in the game and who's not? Right?
Yeah.
So it's just an illustration of the thing that came to my mind so powerfully during his teary protestations in that second tribal council, frankly, was the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, where he got all red in the face and teary too about how upset and horrible it is that someone would make false accusations just because, when I was a kid, I liked beer and it's like that response is actually easy and does not mean that the person didn't do anything.
Right.
when you are worried that an accusation is going to hurt you, it is easy to have that type of reaction regardless of anything. Whereas sometimes people say, oh, well, clearly he wouldn't be so emotional if it wasn't true. Like, this is the, and so I was really frustrated with Dan, because in some ways the things that he says sound like the right answers. Like, oh, if I had any idea, it hurts me so much to the core to know that I might have made anyone feel uncomfortable. Dan, Kelly told you in week 1 that it made her feel uncomfortable. And then not only did you not stop, but did you hear what he whispered when she got voted out? Like, she's having trouble getting the torch in the thing, and he's like, yeah, put that torch down.
Yeah, that really made me angry.
Yeah. So honestly, first of all, I have no confidence whatsoever that Dan's life will be ruined. Again, finger quotes. But frankly, I think his behavior on television is nobody's responsibility but his own, and that he deserves the consequences that he will reap here. That's not to say that we should get into things like internet shaming and that sort of thing, because that's a whole other can of worms. Like, he should not be getting like threats on Twitter or something like that. But also, there's a lot more to it than that. But I think we're certainly agreed that Dan had some extremely poor behavior there. And again, it's like, is it as bad as some other offenders have been? Of course not. It's not as bad, but it's the same basic game and the same basic tricks, right? Of, oh gosh, I just didn't know. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. If I had only known how much this was upsetting you, I of course would have stopped. And then as soon as she leaves the room, it's like, God, what a bitch, right?
Yep.
We see that over and over in society, and it's upsetting to see it play out, because it's one thing to say what's gameplay and what's real. Well, I would say what's real is that someone playing a game was made to feel uncomfortable separate from the game, and was ended up blowing up her own gameplay, ruining her game because of this thing. And I would say that's not a gameplay situation. That is a real situation, that someone competing for $1 million was basically forced out because of someone else's bad behavior. Now, of course, it's more complicated than that to some extent, but it's also, if we could say, what is the responsibility of the show? Because on the one hand, we can say, well, if they talk to Kelly and she does not want them to do anything about it, I'm not saying they should like not respect what she's saying, but I would also say it frankly should not be put on her to make that decision.
Yeah.
Because this is not a he said, she said. They have video of all of this. Right? They
do.
Yeah. So, and again, it's like we saw clips in this episode of, occasional shots where they normally wouldn't use in an episode because you see a camera guy or something for a second. But the point is that, like, we saw very early in the season her have to make the case, I'm actually a germaphobe, which is not true. But using as an excuse to get him to stop touching her, and then feeling like now everybody thinks I'm the weird one that doesn't like to be touched. Why was the warning not given to Dan at that point?
I thought about that a lot too when they went and interviewed. Why did it take until now?
Mm-hmm.
When we clearly saw it earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Because then that changes the dynamics a little bit. Dan gets the warning. Mm-hmm. They do their interviews. Then if we get to this point, well, now they've got to do something because they've already done the warning and the interviews.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when you wait till it gets so bad and then you do the warning, like, well, how much worse does it have to get before you can, you know, act on it?
Right. And just like, you know, is this as serious as punching someone in the face? Well, no, it's a more nebulous thing. But at the same time, there are rules, right?
Right.
And
Yeah, because
just
he's not hurting her physically.
right.
You know, he's hurting her emotionally and
Right.
safely. You
But
know,
the fact that they had that conversation is all about them reminding everybody, hey, there are actual guidelines for code of conduct while you're on the show, and although we encourage lots of sorts of things, there are things that are out of bounds and not allowed. Right? And so putting it on Kelly to have to be the one to say, well, if it's my decision, now I'm the one that made this poor man get voted out of the game when all he did was want to rub her shoulders. And that puts that on Kelly to make that decision. So, of course, she's going to say, no, I don't want to do that. She doesn't want her gameplay to be defined by this. But Dan forces her into that situation. And then the producers let it happen. Now, I mean, eventually, you know, they got there, but at the same time, the producers' behavior led to everything that we saw. Right? You know, this is a perfect example. I talked about this a little bit on 5 More Minutes. But, you know, those of you who only know me from this podcast, or probably are at least peripherally aware that I play a lot of, like role-playing games, Dungeons and Dragons, that sort of thing. But something that has been very much in the air, so to speak, around those types of games recently has been the idea of consent in gameplay. Right? And that's the idea, for example, if you're playing Dungeons and Dragons with someone, part of the fun of those games is that you can just say that your character does anything. Right? And that's an exciting possibility. But what that also potentially does is put you in a situation where, what if one of the other characters says they do something that makes you uncomfortable, makes it not fun for you to play? Right? And so there's a lot of discussion these days about having proactive discussions in advance about what sorts of topics are going to be allowed and what are not allowed. Like maybe there are going to be certain topics where it's like, oh, I don't mind if this happens in the story, but I don't want it graphically depicted. I want it to happen like off camera, so to speak. Right? Or you might just say, I don't want this to happen in the story at all. Or you might just say, I'm a little bit uncomfortable about it, but, you know, we can maybe go forward with it, but I will say something if it feels bad in the moment. Right? And having those sorts of discussions in advance over like what sorts of things are allowed and what are not is a way to, you know, it's a little bit of prep work to try to make sure everybody still has fun throughout the game.
Right.
And I feel like this is a perfect example in this game of Survivor, how their rules, as they've been enforcing them, are probably inadequate because it led to this situation where, you know, some of these girls were, women were put in this situation where they're having to say, well, I'm not going to let this ruin my game, so I'm going to not say anything about this thing that actually makes me feel uncomfortable. And then it becomes a gameplay thing. And I want to talk about that too, just like with Missy and Elizabeth's behavior as well. And then, of course, you know, Lauren was kind of not as egregious, but she was kind of in there. And then, of course, we had Aaron, who hadn't been involved until the actual final tribal council, where he decided to weigh in on the subject and said all of the stupidest things that are often said in that situation by bystanders. You know, it's like, oh, well, if this were real, obviously I would have heard about it. And it's kind of like, well, gosh, Aaron, did you ever think that maybe you didn't hear about it because people don't see you as a safe person to confide in? Because maybe when you do hear about it, you think it didn't happen because you didn't hear about it sooner. It's like, what do you think's happening right now? You're hearing about it. Yeah, and so like
Yeah.
it's worth noting, I think, that Aaron, Missy, Elizabeth, and Lauren have all posted like public apologies for their behavior on the show. Um, the only one that I actually like watched was I watched Aaron's video, which is a little weird because he's clearly in some sort of like some like cheap conference rooms looking sort of place, and there's something like that every 30 seconds is going beep beep, which is like, why you couldn't have, like, you're doing this video to post somewhere,
Right.
you couldn't have figured out a better anyway. But it was a pretty good apology video as these things go, where he's basically saying, in the moment I was so wrapped up in everything that I was really not seeing clearly, and watching back made me feel ashamed of my behavior. And he seems genuinely emotional and contrite about it. And so like, it's one of those things. It's like, how sincere is it? It's always that thing of like, well, are you trying to damage control because you got caught, or are you really sorry? And those two things overlap with each other, right?
Yeah.
But at the very least, there are bad apologies and there are good apologies. And this one, I think, was on the good end of the spectrum. The Missy, Lauren, and Elizabeth, I think, had like text apologies where they mostly said the right things, but it was also, it's just one of those things where it's like, Google text for how to do a good apology. It's saying all of the right sorts of things, but it's, again, coached at this point.
Right. Well, I think they were like Aaron. While I was frustrated,
Mm-hmm.
he did kind of come into it in a weird spot.
Yeah, like he
And,
wasn't involved really before. He was just a dick about it in the tribal council is all.
right. And so you're right. He does need to apologize for that behavior.
Mm-hmm.
But the other three, they were intimately involved in making this into a big deal by agreeing with her
Yeah.
and reassuring her, and then going behind her back and saying, no, Dan, you're good. Like, we're just using this to like
Mm-hmm.
target her.
Yeah.
Which, to your point, is like that's when it sort of leaves and plays out like real life,
Mm-hmm.
where maybe they didn't target her because of this, but they just
Yeah.
needed something to get on her, and because they weren't bothered, like they kind of missed
Mm-hmm.
that this was bigger than the game, and that Kelly was
Yeah.
having genuinely uncomfortable feelings. And you even see some things in there that just really didn't sit well with me. And that's what I said. Like, I genuinely like them, all of them.
Mm-hmm.
And this made me not,
Yeah.
and again, I can forgive it. I get where they're coming from, and I kind of,
I
like you
I
said, once it steeped a little bit, I was like, okay, they truly believed that they were separating the game from the reality of it, and they kind of were numb to what they had done.
yeah.
Doesn't make it okay, but yeah,
Well,
I
honestly,
kind of get it.
yeah, like it is a little bit murky because of the game, right?
Right.
And this is again where I think that probably at a certain point the producers should have stepped in and said, "Okay, hold on. This is starting to spin a little bit out of control. Let's take a step back and decide what we want to actually decide is allowed versus not allowed in this type of situation." Because I think it was clear that, conversation or not, with the title card, right? Like, uh, they were allowing this to spin out of control. So they sit everybody down, but then it's hands off again. And it was clear based on some of the ways that people referred to those conversations that, like, Dan still acted like he didn't even know what anyone was talking about. So whether he is just totally in denial about it, or whether they were really unclear about what was going on. And then everyone else was having to say, like, they had to like figure out that it was about Dan. And so, like, that makes me wonder about the actual content of those meetings and how serious they actually were, right?
Yep. Yeah. And I think I said earlier that in reflection, I had softened a little bit on the producers, but
Hmm.
talking through it with you, I think I'm coming back more to my original reaction, which
Hmm.
was my gut reaction, which was to be very frustrated with them.
Hmm.
You're making a lot of good points that bring me back to that. And I am less forgiving of them than I was before. I mean, I think
Hmm.
you're 100% right.
Yeah.
I think this should have been one where, I mean,
They should have pumped the brakes much sooner.
much sooner.
Yeah.
And it comes down to the same thing. I mean, it's you pump the brakes sooner. If this continues at this point, you're well within your rights as a producer to just remove him from the game and make the situation go away.
Yeah.
And had they then gone and targeted Kelly because she was the one that fanned this up and got Dan eliminated,
Hmm.
I, at that point, like,
Well,
okay, that's what you got to do. If that's what you're going to do, then you
yeah.
live with that. And I think Kelly could have lived with that too.
Yeah. But things like that title card and the unusual steps of them actually having the producer's off screen voice talking to Kelly, like those smacked to me of CBS saying, holy crap, we might actually be in a position here where people have legitimate criticisms of how we handled this. So we need to make a show of that we did do something. We weren't just doing nothing, except that we know the producers making decisions on the fly have competing priorities where they're simultaneously, of course, there's an aspect of them wanting to keep all the players safe and feeling okay, but they also want the drama for the TV, right? And
Right.
so
And
essentially,
CBS is not innocent of this stuff in the past. And
yeah,
it's,
like remember what bringing Brandon Hance back on the show a second time and how badly that went?
well, and I'm even talking about removing from the game.
Hmm.
It, they are not in a position where their hands are clean of some of this
Right.
stuff that
Hmm.
happened in the industry. And, and, and I kind of dismissed it when I read it because it's, I mean, a very, very popular internet troll because he's very clever and really kind of cuts to the bone on some of this stuff and um, kind of talked about like and he always says it in like a really smug, sarcastic way.
Hmm.
Kind of pointed to this too, like weird that the network of like Les Moonves and some of the other things he mentioned like a number of the things that they've sort of been involved in like some of the collusion on the Epstein stuff and like
Hmm.
just weird stuff. And it's like you're really going to go to bat for Dan on this one when you're one of the culprits in all of this like stuff. And I kind of laughed at it and it was like sort of laughed it off as like, oh yeah, because he says it a very sarcastic way. And it's
Hmm.
like, yeah, and then it's kind of sat with me a little bit and it's just like, I mean, they're right, like they almost have an obligation to go above and beyond.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm definitely boomeranging on any leeway I gave the producers because
Right.
all of these things are right. You're right. He was right. Kelly was right. Like this shouldn't have gotten to the point where we had to watch this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
And you and I both like Jeff Probst, but
mhm.
he is absolutely on the team making those sorts of decisions, right?
Yeah,
This is not happening with him in a vacuum. Now, like, I think that in general, I liked how hard he pressed in the actual tribal council. And there were some elements of that where obviously he's having to kind of decide what to do next live, but it's not like he is uninvolved with everything up to that point.
right.
So,
He
like he,
and part of why he's so good in the tribal council is that he is well prepared entering it
mm-hmm,
for the direction he intends to take it. He's talked through scenarios of
mm-hmm,
this and that, and that's part of what makes him so good is he's well prepared, but he also
mm-hmm,
can adjust on the fly. And even he seemed in that second tribal council in particular
Hmm.
just a little in over his head on some of this, and
Yeah.
that's and for him to be that way meant this was a really bad situation.
Yeah, I think there might have been some panicking behind the camera in those couple of days of just like, oh, this is going really bad, but we're not really sure where the line is or should be. Maybe it's okay to let it just play out as long as we talk about it and don't pretend that it didn't happen.
Right. And then you have like the Aaron reaction, and you have some of
Hmm.
the other things where it's like, wow, like what do I do with that? Like how do
Hmm.
I right the ship after, and again, he probably is one of the only ones that gets a little bit, because he did come into it weird, and yet he had a terrible reaction. He acted
Yeah.
like a dick.
Hmm.
But and I'm glad to know that he, upon reflection, realized like how
Yeah.
much of a dick he acted like.
Yeah.
And that's okay. I mean, it's not great, but it's,
Well, it's better than not apologizing.
right.
But yeah, and again, it's like he was not the instigator of that situation or anything. I want
But
to
then it's
circle
like, but
back.
you have that, and like, where does Probst
Yeah.
go from there? Like, well, you
Yeah.
try to get him to talk about it, and now you've
Hmm.
got a guy like, antagonizing everyone
Yeah.
who, you know,
Right. Well,
was
like, to Probst's credit, like, even if we want to say things should have been intervened much sooner, and he shares some responsibility for those types of decisions, because he's an executive producer on the show, right?
yep,
So that when we talk about the producers, Jeff Probst is in that group.
yep,
But at the same time, I did like how hard he pressed on that, of
yep,
not letting Dan get away with just trying to pretend it was nothing. And I could imagine Probst feeling a little bit pissed, like, dude, we had to pull you aside and talk to you, and you're going to try to pretend now like that didn't happen?
right.
Um,
You got a warning, bro. Like,
yeah.
obviously did something.
So I like that, but it was also, it was too late. It should have happened sooner. But I want to circle back just to talk about Missy and Elizabeth, because certainly they're getting a lot of hate, and I think criticism is certainly justified.
Mm-hmm.
Um, with Missy, it's a little bit murky, because I think for her it was more, at least in the first episode, it was directly more tied to. I think that she did share genuine feelings with Kelly when she was, describing her own experiences, but then she heard that Kelly was targeting her, right? So then she's trying to turn it around and say, I'm going to use anything I can. And this felt like leverage. But, and then roping in Elizabeth about it, who, like, in this episode, again, it's like, I don't like the idea that you're doing this. It feels over the line. The idea that you would pretend to be more worried about this than you really are. Especially with the whole Janet situation, because, like, Janet wasn't even part of the plan. Like, she didn't vote for Kelly. So, like, this whole thing of trying to talk to Janet and persuade Janet that this is really a problem, like, how is that gameplay? Like, how does that further this goal of voting out Kelly? It really doesn't.
Hmm.
It's all about, like, this idea of, like, we need Kelly to think that we're doing this, right? But, like, even Kelly had to be talked into the idea of voting for Dan, which she only did on the basis of being told that the votes were there, right?
Yep.
And so Janet and Kelly really did, like, they're the ones that suffered from this whole thing. And, and then of course Janet is in this position of saying, well, when it's just one person, these things are complicated. I don't want to necessarily get, in the middle of something when I don't understand the whole situation. But then when I'm hearing that it's more, and the thing is, it was more, right? We know at least that Missy was uncomfortable with it. We know that Molly had been earlier. And then, just, with some of the other girls, just because they don't mind doesn't mean the behavior's not still there, right? It's just a question
Right.
of like, they're more willing to let it pass. And so, Janet, I think, was really mistreated by them, and I think that it was over the line for Missy. Like Missy, I think, at least in this first hour, was really kind of like, this was a sketchy way to react to realizing, oh well, she's targeting me, well I'm going to target her back. And then for roping in Elizabeth, who literally was feeling like, I don't even mind, but I'm going to pretend I do, because Missy at least actually did have a problem with it and
Right.
was
She
just
just
using
decided to
it
get
as
over it
like,
because it benefited her.
right,
Yeah.
yeah, so she's willing to say, well I'm going to talk about it as cover, but it's different than saying, well I really have no problem with it, but I'm going to pretend I do. Yeah, and I think those are both over the line. But where I was really just, I think that they knew how sketchy that was. And that's why they just doubled down and dug in when it all blew up in the next hour. And the way that they tried to gaslight Janet about what they had said, and the way they talked out, out of both sides of their mouth with Janet and with Dan, of like, Dan, we never said anything like that. She's crazy. We never said anything like that. We're totally on your side. She's making it all up from scratch. And then when Janet calls them on it in the middle of the night, they finally say, okay, you're right. We did say that. And then as soon as Janet walks away, they say, oh, but we were only saying it to get her off our back. It's like at that point, and then when everybody's sort of gathering around Dan, where he gets to cry his crocodile tears of the unfairly accused, that's where I was disappointed in everybody still on, I think, was Jamal there in that group? I don't know. I mean, he
I don't
certainly,
think so.
yeah. So him and Janet certainly, I think, managed to, I think, skate out of that whole mess without getting it on them, so to speak, in terms of bad behavior. Like, I think Jamal was pretty great in the whole thing in terms of like, and the way he approached it in the tribal council, of like when he heard a couple of people saying stuff like Aaron's stuff, and the way Dan was replying, you could see on his face that feeling, that same expression of like before he had that conversation with Jack, which is like, this is not good for my game to say this, but I have to, because that's some BS that is being said right now. Right. And so he gets out there and he's just, basically calling Aaron, is like, look, the fact that you didn't hear about it doesn't mean it didn't happen. It meant that they weren't comfortable telling you about it. And the way you're acting right now maybe means they were right to feel that way.
Right.
And so it's like, so he said some great stuff, unfortunately, just before getting voted out. And then note in that whole argument, in that final tribal council, where Janet is feeling distraught and horrified, Lauren, I think at that point, is recognizing that even though she was more peripheral to the original issue, she was somewhat complicit and was feeling guilty about it. So we see her trying to at least navigate it, but Missy and Elizabeth just keeping their mouths shut during that whole thing. And it was really damning, I thought. Just like, it's one thing to feel sorry about it later, and that's better than not feeling sorry about it, but it doesn't change that you did some crappy stuff. And I don't want to defend them at all, but here's where we can also turn it back to the design of the game and what it encourages people to do. Right? One of the, just to take it back to like tabletop role playing games again, another one of the game design discussions is the idea of, what does a game reward players for doing? Like, if there are points or experience points or bonuses or whatever in the game, what do you do to get them? Because that is what the game is telling you to do, right?
Right.
And what this game tells its players to do is to deceive and backstab and behave with drama. And when the lines of what is allowed and what is not are blurry ones, you're going to sometimes get a situation like we did this time.
Yep.
Yeah. So, I think there've been a lot of people online talking about how they don't feel like they want to keep watching Survivor after this, and frankly, I don't blame them for feeling that way, because it really does not only just sour us on a lot of the remaining players. Like, it's how do you root for half the people left in the game at this point?
Yep.
Right? That's hard, because we were talking, we talk so often in the scene about how great is it when you get to emerge and you feel like everyone still on the game is interesting to one degree or another, and then it's like, okay, well, we've just cut 90% of that. So that's frustrating. And I'm certainly going to keep watching, partly because I want to see how they try to course correct from this.
Yep.
It's clear by the way they departed from their normal format that they understood that this was a big deal, which is not in and of itself like excusing anything, right? But it was more like, it's at least there's an awareness, whereas there have been past seasons where there were conflicts of this type and other types where they really just basically kept it quiet, and it only just sort of came out through like leaks and interviews months later, right? There have been times stuff like that happen. I mean, think about how early seasons treated the idea of the guys deciding to walk around naked, right?
Yeah.
Like, that was presented as funny, the way those guys were making the women feel uncomfortable by walking around naked.
Yeah.
So this is not a show. It's exactly like you were saying earlier. The producers and CBS here does not have clean hands even going into this. And so they need to do better. I hope that they can try to do better. And whether or not this season is salvageable, who can say? It probably depends a lot on how things actually go from here, right? Like if we're sitting here with Dan in the finals, that's going to be really upsetting.
Exactly. And I'm willing to give him a try too, but I also understand the gut reaction of not wanting to watch it anymore, because I kind of felt that way at parts of this episode. Like, I don't feel like exposing, like, I just don't feel like being a part of this.
Not fun to watch.
Yeah. And I don't need to do it. So,
and there are frankly too many good TV shows on TV these days to spend time on something that's not fun to watch.
Right.
It's just, it's just there's better ways to spend your time than to watch TV shows you don't like.
Yep. So, I mean, I'm going to be optimistic. They've done a good job for however many years, and
yeah, I mean, they've been going a long time. This has certainly attracted a lot of attention. I hope that it is something where, we can watch them react to this and maybe have better, more clear guidelines for conduct in the future. It's and it's the sort of thing where, let's not put the pressure, but like, it was just so tragic and unfortunate that even though we had a couple of examples earlier this season, which in hindsight now feel deliberate, of seeing people talk through these things and work them out, that in this particular circumstance, this ripped from the headlines Me Too issue turned out exactly the way it so often does in the real world, which is that the people who speak out get punished and the people who are accused mostly don't. So that sucks. Yeah. So I think we'll probably leave it there, because I don't know what else is there even really to talk about with these two episodes. I mean, we could talk about, like, obviously in hindsight, Kelly getting voted out with 2 idols in her pocket was really like,
especially when she purposely looked for the second idol just because of that, but anyway, I think it just
Yeah,
added to the
but
frustration about everything.
right.
You know?
But yeah, it's so there, there were other things that happened, but they pale in importance. And so we'll see. I'm going to watch the next episode and see how they try to, correct the nosedive here. But, you know,
Me as
pretty
well.
unambiguous that these 2 hours of Survivor sucked bad. And not even just in a bad season kind of way. Like, you
Yeah,
know.
it was no good. So we will give
Hmm.
them the benefit of the doubt on them moving forward correctly until
Hmm.
we see. So,
Yep. All right.
all
So
right.
I think that's going to do it for this time. Thank you everybody for watching and or listening, and we'll be back for more Survivor. If you're still interested in joining us, we'll be talking about next episode when it happens. Um, and yeah, that's how it'll be. So uh, in the meantime, let's leave it here. So try to survive until the next episode. I said it weird that time, but good night, everybody.
Right.